Welcome to the Center for Conservative Women. My name is Julie, and today we are hosting the lovely Antonia Okafor. And before we begin the webinar, if you're new to our organization, our mission is to prepare women for effective leadership and to promote leading conservative women. We do this through many ways, some of which include campus lectures, webinars, summits, and our internship program. We encourage our supporters and students to be active ambassadors of conservative philosophy in their schools, workplaces, and communities. If you'd like to learn more about the Center for Conservative Women, please visit our website at cblwomen.org and follow us on our social media platforms at the handle cblwomen. We thank you for joining us today as we host Antonia Okafor. Antonia is the Director of Outreach and National Spokesperson for Gun Owners of America. Her written work has been published by the New York Times, NBC Universal, Fox News, the Austin American-Statesman, and The Hill. She regularly appears as a contributor to many news outlets, some of which include CNN, Fox News, BBC, and Al Jazeera America. Antonia is the graduate of the University of Texas at Dallas with a Bachelor of Arts in International Political Economy. She first noticed her passion for service through Girl Scouts of America, where she has earned both her silver and her gold awards. During her college years, she participated in numerous nonprofit organizations. Today, she will be speaking on the topic, Gun Rights Are Women's Rights. And we all know that in the recent years, the Second Amendment has come under attack pretty significantly. However, after the recent administration change, many freedom-loving Americans are quite nervous and concerned about the steps that are being taken to break apart the Second Amendment. So we find that it's more important now than ever before for young women, really all Americans, but especially young women, to know the value of our Second Amendment. So with all of that in mind, please join me in welcoming Antonia Okafor.
All right. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, everything looks
okay.
Good. Thank you so much.
All right. Great. Thank you guys so much for being here. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk to you guys, you ladies, guys or ladies, whoever. It's been an incredible year, a very interesting year. So this is actually, I believe, my first speech since, well, pre-COVID. So I'm really excited to be here talking to you guys, especially since I was supposed to speak at University of Wisconsin next week, but they decided that this environment, particularly the climate of the Second Amendment and talking about the Second Amendment, it wasn't a good time to talk about it. So they canceled my speech. So I'm really excited to be a part of an organization. You guys have been great to me for a long time. I would not have actually not left my wedding, but went during my honeymoon to DC to speak to you guys at a summit just almost 2 years ago now. If I didn't think this organization was incredibly important. And I love what you guys stand for, and I love the members that are part of this organization. So thank you guys for being here, and thanks for having me. So to start with my journey on the Second Amendment journey in general, I would have to go back to my beginnings. And my beginnings were actually not the typical 2A advocate beginnings. I didn't grow up with a father who took me hunting. I didn't have firearms in the home. For the most part, what I knew about firearms or guns, etc., were things that I saw mostly negative on TV and in movies. I grew up in a suburb of Dallas, Texas, but my parents are actually Nigerian immigrants. And so, yes, I grew up in Texas, but for the most part, I didn't have that background. And I always like to say my little, bear with me here, my little joke that, you know, the Second Amendment was foreign to my parents, but it was, and it was foreign to me for the most part. So not only did I not know about the Second Amendment, I wasn't a big advocate. For the most part, we grew up Democrat, and we grew up with everything that entailed, which was, I would like to say, the enough is enough mantra, that every time a mass shooting came on the TV screen or in a movie, that I would just go along to get along with the rest of the Democratic platform. And that continued until the Second Amendment and personal defense became very personal and real to me. So in order for you guys to understand why I became such a huge advocate for the Second Amendment and for why gun rights are women's rights and why I push that message so strongly, is because going back to when I was 5 years old, there was a significant time and period where I realized that it was going to be up to me and me alone to defend myself. When I was 5 years old, I was sexually assaulted, and the worst, type of sexual assault there is. And at that time, I realized that if I was ever going to empower myself again, I had to find what means that was going to be for myself. And I went through different ways of empowering myself. And for the most part, by the time I went to college, my way was going through modern feminism, which modern feminism, I'm sure people have different ideas of what it is, but for the most part, people would agree that it usually has to do with quote unquote reproductive rights or abortion rights, but also the fact that more than likely you're going to see the Moms of Man Action, the gun control activists on the side, or say they're on the side of feminism, or the feminism side on the side of gun control. And so that's what I was part of. And in college, I was very active in organizations that said that we're empowering to women. I was part of organizations that helped women in domestic violence and in domestic abuse. I was part of awareness groups that empowered women to be a part of politics. All great and amazing things, and things I still support today. The one thing that really was important to me, and I think pivotal to me, was when I was part of planning and hosting a event on my college campus. I went to UT Dallas in the Dallas suburbs area of Texas. And unfortunately, the biggest thing that I saw over and over again was that the only solution to be able to empower the women around me, particularly my peers, particularly the students on campus, was always focused on what happened after the fact, what happened to the perpetrator, what we could do with the male when it came to campus sexual assault, when it came to domestic violence. And I was sick and tired of waiting for that to be the only solution. I realized that there was something we could do beforehand. And one thing that I realized that could be done beforehand was to help empower the women, particularly in situations where they only had one means of getting out of that situation, where men are just, and I'm gonna get upset, but men pound per pound are on average have more lean muscle mass than women. And so they're usually stronger than women. And so I knew that if we really were going to empower women, then I realized that we really had to bring in the conversation of the Second Amendment. We had to bring in the conversation that if I know that I'm a capable woman, and I know that I am, then why can't I train and have access to whatever weapon or whatever tool that I can use in order to defend myself and also defend the people I care about? So unfortunately, once I brought that up one time, I was as quickly ostracized. I was quickly quieted and silenced in the feminist movement, particularly on college campuses. And the more that I tried to bring up that new solution, which is not very new, but a solution that I believe that went hand in hand with quote unquote modern feminism, the more that I got people who were at the time my friends, the people who I thought supported me in the feminist movement, who pushed me out of the feminist movement. And because of that, I decided to delve more into this marriage between the Second Amendment and female empowerment. And I was a student, and still am a student of the history of feminism. And that has always been important to me, again, like I said, because I was at a point when I was 5 years old of being in the most vulnerable and defenseless situation anyone can ever be. And I didn't want that for myself ever again. And more importantly, I didn't want any other woman to be in that situation as well. And so I decided to go and research for myself what it meant to be pro-women and be pro-empowerment, but be pro-Second Amendment as well. And at that time, actually, President Obama was actually doing a countrywide, nationwide campus sexual assault survey on college campuses. It was around 2011, 2012. And part of the findings and studies that I found were that there were a lot of sexual assaults happening in the places that we quote unquote thought were safe. Even in the school that I was at, in the university that I was at, I remember we're getting texts where it would tell me that this person over here was sexually assaulted, or this person across the street at the park near our university, that they were obviously sexually assaulted in the evening while they were just going to the restroom or going to the park. So I knew that it was the reality that was that there was nowhere that was safe. There was no area that, you know, the universities want you to believe that you are in a safe space. That the reality of the matter is that anything, tragedy can strike on campus, off campus. And so I realized that if I really wanted to protect myself and those I care about, I needed to have a gun. I needed to be able to protect myself, train with it. And at the time, I was already 21. So I actually legally in Texas could have gotten my concealed carry permit. But the problem was that I, as a student, was on campus at least 90% of the time. And so at that time, you weren't allowed to have a concealed carry permit, or rather a firearm on campus. And so I was part of the movement that realized that feminism and empowering women and being on a campus as a student meant that I should have every right to defend myself, that there should not be an arbitrary line between the college campus that I was on and going off college campus when it comes to protecting myself. And so I was part of the leadership that helped pass that law, concealed carry, on college campuses in Texas. It was a movement that had already been 7 states strong. Texas became the 8th state to have campus carry. And I kept leading that movement afterwards because I realized that if I was going to help other women like me see that the Second Amendment was actually for them, then I had to start an organization that would actually equip and educate and empower women to do so. And so not too long afterwards, although I got a lot of pushback on both sides of the field, of the argument, those on the Second Amendment side who didn't want me to talk about feminism because, you know, that's the F word you're not supposed to say. And then also on the other side, the feminist movement that didn't want to talk about gun rights, instead wanted to focus on gun control. And so bringing those two sides together, I realized that being pro Second Amendment and being pro women are not mutually exclusive. And I started Empower 2A as a way to get more young women like me into this Second Amendment movement that would empower themselves and empower other people and change the narrative that was unfortunately pushed through for so long. But you know what, our history shows, particularly as women, and even in the suffrage movement and even in the feminist movement, if you're going to go there, empowerment in general, that women's rights have always been on the side of gun rights, just like the same thing with the civil rights movement. As an African-American woman, I have seen both sides be benefited in history from gun rights. Going into just African-Americans, going into the fact that Jim Crow was specifically about implementing gun control that kept people starting from slave era, where they called slave codes, to Black codes, to what Jim Crow at the 50s and 60s would push as essentially the same type of gun control that kept African Americans from being able to protect themselves against the real racists, against the real people who wanted to use firearms to harm people who were freed slaves. So they, through the law, would keep African Americans from having these guns. Same thing with women who were pushing through for women's rights. People know about Annie Oakley and those really big female figures in history, but they don't think about Susan B. Anthony, who was actually a big proponent about protecting yourself and self-defense, who wanted women to protect themselves as well as be pro-life. But that's a different conversation. But all in all, when you look in the history of women and in female empowerment, and you look at the history of African Americans and civil rights movement, those who were key figures were more than likely always on the side of pro self-defense. And why not? Because it's not only a woman's right, it's not only an African American's right, it's not even American right. Your right to defend yourself and to protect those that you care about, to keep and bear arms, is a right that is only given because you're human. It has nothing to do with the geography of where you live, of what you look like, of even your background or your alternative background. All it matters is that you're a human being and it's a human right. And so with that, I've pushed that narrative since then. And it's given me enemies on both sides. It's also given me supporters and people who are able to actually relate with me, not only as a Black woman who is pushing for Second Amendment rights for everybody, but also as a person who is a proponent of women's rights and wants to show people what women's rights in history and now actually looks like, what real female empowerment looks like. So all that to say, I want to thank you guys so much for having me today, and I'm looking forward to all the questions that you guys have on gun rights or women's rights.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your story. I really appreciate you being honest and open, because that is it's a difficult thing to be talking about, but it's really important. We've had several questions come in before the webinar, actually, which is kind of fun. One of them said, can you tell us, because I experienced this with some of my friends. I grew up, I shot my first gun when I was 5 years old. I've been shooting my entire life. So I don't really remember much of the process of learning because I was so young. But I recently talked to a few young women who are really nervous about shooting for the first time. And one of these young ladies said, can you tell us about the first time you shot a firearm? Were you nervous? Like, can you talk about the moment? Like, how did it feel? Was it as scary as it looks like?
Yeah, I still remember very clearly. For you ladies, I'll tell you that I'm now 31, but I actually shot my first firearm at 25. And so I was a graduate student when I was doing a lot of these things with pushing for concealed carry on college campuses. So it was actually a local firearms instructor, male, that found out that I was being harassed and cyberbullied, essentially, and stalked by a man who had a history, actually, of battery towards women, who was anti-gun, I know, but that was also stalking me. And so that firearms instructor locally found out about that. He told me that, something similar had happened to his own daughter, and he didn't want that to happen to me. And so I was a college student, didn't have much money. And so even though I was advocating for the right for us to be able to take care of ourselves on campus and have a gun on campus, guns are expensive, and even taking lessons are expensive. And that's why I'm such a big proponent for constitutional carry, but I'll talk about that later. But he, by the goodness of his own heart, took me under his wing and helped me shoot for the first time. And I still remember shooting that. I think he actually started with a 9mm. I think I was feeling a little bit better about shooting. I wish I had started with a 22, but oh well. I do that with my students that I instruct now. I start with 22s. So I started with a 9, and I remember that first feeling of shooting, of being so scared that, all the things that you hear about, oh, it's gonna just go off on you, and all those things that you would think someone who's pro-gun rights would already understand by then. But just like any other tool, you have to learn how to use it. You have to learn what it looks like when you train with it in a personal level. It's always different than looking at somebody else do it. So when I finally did it and I had it under the instruction of a professional, I felt safe with it, but I also felt, most importantly, empowered. And that's actually where I got the name for my organization, Empowered, not too long after that. It was that feeling of empowerment, of getting that empowerment back that I had lost at such a young age.
Wow, thank you. Somebody else wants to know, what's your favorite concealed handgun?
Ooh. This is why it's good that I'm never sponsored by gun. Otherwise I'd be like, well, so I'm not sponsored by any gun companies. So if that helps with that, I would say, if you're talking about a specific type, like company, I really love the SIGs. I really do. I tried multiple firearms. So for two reasons, I love Sig Sauers. I love Sigs because I still haven't had, especially for the price range, which is not too bad. I think they are great shots. Like I've always had really good experience with the recoil, which is not that much, honestly, even with the 9mm, and also the fact that this frame is smaller, which tends to, on most firearms, if you have a smaller firearm, then you're gonna feel every time that you pull that trigger, you're gonna feel the recoil, and it's considered snappy. You'll hear snappy when it comes to revolvers, and that means that you feel every time that you're pulling that trigger, and it's something that most people don't like because the more you feel that firearm, the less likely you're gonna want to train with it, and the less likely you're probably gonna, carry it every day. And so the SIGs, especially the 938, is probably my favorite just because you can customize it. They're beautiful guns, but they're very well made, and the price point is not too much more than, say, your Smith & Wesson or those kind of middle of the road type of firearms.
Yeah, I always recommend going to a range and just trying a variety.
Yes.
So you can feel the kind that fits your hand, because everybody has a different size or shape to their hand. So
Right.
something will fit in your hand and it'll just feel comfortable. And then I think at that point you can get comfortable enough to practice more because you're not feeling like you have to shift it around a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
That's something interesting. Someone else would like to know, do you know what legislation or initiatives are happening right now that ensure women have the right to defend themselves using a gun? Or what are some ways that women can protect the Second Amendment in the courtroom?
That's really good. Well, so they're never gonna, with legislation, right? Especially particularly the anti-gun side, they're never going to come out and say this legislation is going to prevent women from carrying a firearm, right? Just because that'll be a little too obvious. There is the Violence Against Women Act right now that they have to re-up it all the time in the federal level. Most people, again, they're masters of narratives, and we're controlling the narrative. And of course you think, well, what's wrong with the Violence Against Women Act? There's nothing wrong with that, except the fact of the matter is the way that they think that we are going to prevent violence against women is that, honestly, they use a lot of sexist language of thinking that women, and they kind of do openly say it this way, where they believe that women are more likely to have a gun used against them than for a woman to be using a firearm to defend themselves, which is not true. Just like most feminists should know, is that we can do anything men can do, and that's particularly true with firearms. So they do a lot of legislation that comes to domestic violence victims, to sexual assault survivors, where they prevent these people from even having the opportunity to utilize a firearm in that situation because of that sexist view of thinking if there's a firearm in that situation, it's more likely only going to be used by the male. And if the woman uses it, they're not going to use it effectively. And so that's the type of language, if you're looking at legislation like the Violence Against Women's Act, that unfortunately, again, focuses more on gun control versus gun rights. And that also limits women who are particularly benefit the most from gun rights from being able to utilize those firearms when they need it. We also have a lot of states actually right now that don't allow you to use lethal means of defense in the case of rape, for example. There are states right now where you will get in trouble first, where you can't use as a self-defense reason for self-defense if you use lethal means of protecting yourself, because they don't consider rape as, unfortunately, they don't consider rape as important as someone who's in imminent danger physically in a different way. So those are the types of legislation that I'm actually helping a lot of female organizations on the Second Amendment, on the state level, who are trying to get things like that taken care of. Again, they're not going to have that act just push out and say, look, this is a sexist law. But if you actually look at the reading of it and the language, you notice that it actually impacts women even more so than men, but also it just keeps women in general from being able to exercise that Second Amendment right, just like anybody else.
Wow, that's astonishing. I did not even know that fact. That's horrifying, which leads me to this next question, which is really interesting. how is it that liberals are so often able to lie and mislead about gun control issues, and conservatives don't seem to be able to effectively communicate these types of things very well? How does that happen? How do we get away with it? Or they get away with it?
I think, and if you had asked me this, say, earlier on in my activism, I don't think I would have understood a little bit more of the mentality of someone who was anti-gun to someone who was pro-gun, and then becoming an advocate. That's like a next level, right? You can be pro-gun and not be an advocate. But being an advocate and such a strong advocate now, and being a part of outreach, I have seen why it can be very easy to become so passionate about a topic, but unfortunately not realize that the way that you execute that message and that narrative, sometimes you can become so passionate or even angry, if you say it that way, that you deter people who would have listened to your message from actually listening to it. So they essentially cut you off. They might not listen to you because you're saying in a way that really is ostracizing them from being a part of including them into the conversation. And so just being able to relate the very differences that you have between that person who's anti-gun and yourself. Like for me, I always try to remember who I was as an anti-gun person and the real fears that they had, instead of belittling the fears that they had, which would just keep them from listening to me altogether. I think having that relationship, having that way to be able to relate to them in that level, and of course, just being a civil person in that conversation, as passionate as I can get, it really does a big difference when it comes to persuading someone who would have ultimately not listened to you if you had done it in a different way. So I think that's the biggest thing, is that I see a lot of people forget that way of persuading, and they just automatically believe, they'll say, shall not be infringed, which is true and is a Second Amendment, but people need to know how it relates to them on a personal level, and tell your story and share your story. And I think that resonates with a lot more people versus just yelling the Second Amendment at them. So unfortunately, our side does that a lot, or at least sometimes the media portrays that as the only side. Those people who do push that type of narrative or that way of doing things and make it seem like that's everybody on the two-way side, and that's not true.
Do you feel social media is an effective workaround to like media narratives on this issue for conservatives?
I do think it's pros and cons to it, right? It's a great way to get away from the traditional media that has only allowed certain voices and faces, like I was talking about. The anti-gun side wants that person who's, and there's nothing wrong with that, but they want to perpetuate that stereotype of it's a white male only, and it's a guy that's racist only, and it's a person who wants machine guns and wants to harm people. Like that's what they want the pro-gun side to look like. They don't want an African-American woman who talks about her time of being anti-gun to being pro-gun, or stuff like that, which is actually going to get more people on our side. So there's that aspect of things, of it being very orchestrated, that we only see one side of the argument, on both sides too, right? It's the same thing with us seeing anti-gun people. It's not just people who just hate firearms. A lot of them are fearful of firearms, just like I was. So I think that's the biggest thing, is that a lot of the times media is keeping the real voices of the Second Amendment movement, which is very diverse, which if you go to any gun range, you'll see how diverse it is, how it's not just white males, which is nothing wrong with white males, but it's everybody, it's women, it's a lot of Black women. There's a lot of people who don't even know the very statistics that Black women are the fastest growing demographic of gun owners. You won't hear about that. And that's because those are stats that people are not going to just see on titles of articles. They're going to have to do the digging and the work to find that type of info, but it's out there.
Yeah. One thing, I'm not sure if you know this, one of the things we do with our interns for part of our program is we take them all to the range and do professional training with firearms. And it's one of my favorite days because I get paid to go to the range.
Yeah, but especially ammo.
Yeah, especially ammo. It is not, but it is really important to cross some of those barriers, I think, with everyone that you can, and just talk to them. And I've seen the same thing that you said at the range. It is literally a mixture of everyone.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
it's not the stereotype that people imagine and like they envision that Hollywood tells us. Something I'd like for you to talk about, because I know a lot of people have asked me this question and I'm not even that versed in it. Can you explain what red flag laws are and what the problem with them? What's the problem?
Yeah, so that's another topic that, again, as much as I'm an advocate, it's always been about education and learning. And the more I've learned, the better I've become versed about topics like red flag laws. I think people hear red flag laws and they think, what's the problem with that? That we don't want, don't want guns in wrong people's hands. But I think particularly as conservatives, I think it's easier for us to realize, especially now in these days, where because we have a different viewpoint or we think differently or we voted for somebody differently than somebody else, that it's very easy, especially nowadays, for someone to take that as, like you hear about, as violent, as dangerous, as a viewpoint that, because it's not the same viewpoint they have, something that can be used against you because they don't think that, that they think you're a dangerous person because you think of something differently than they do. And so with that in mind, I actually was educated about red flag laws from, it was actually after I spoke at the Young Women's Leadership Summit a few years ago in Dallas. And it was a Air Force veteran, a female Air Force veteran who had been suffering with PTSD, who actually came up to me after the speech and told me about her concern about red flag laws. This was actually right after the Parkland shooting and also the Santa Fe shooting that happened in Texas. And people were talking about red flag laws. And a lot of Republicans were saying, well, maybe this is the way that we do common sense, type of compromise. And so she told me that it was actually detrimental to her because red flag laws, unfortunately, she's seen as a red flag because she has PTSD. People consider her a danger. And unfortunately, she has PTSD because she's a sexual assault survivor herself. Not only that she's a veteran, and she's been in the military, but she's also a sexual assault survivor. And so she educated me on the fact of the matter is that mental health can be seen as anything from depression, which millions of people are being medicated for depression and anxiety in America. And those same people would be seen as a danger to not only themselves, but to other people if they have firearms in the home. So a great way to show what it actually looks like right now is to look at Colorado. So I actually lived in Colorado for a couple of years before I moved back to Houston in Texas. They passed red flag laws on the state level of Colorado, say about a year or 2 years ago. And already immediately after that was passed, which in the state of Colorado means that anybody who has known you, even an acquaintance, for at least 6 months can call the sheriff's office, can call the police department and tell them that you are a danger to yourself or to other people and that you also have firearms in your home. So at that point, the sheriff's office or the police department will then go to a judge and they will ask for a no-knock search warrant, where they will get it from the judge, and that no-knock search warrant will be implemented by the sheriff's department and the police department, where they will go into your home. They will not no-knock, meaning they don't have to tell you that they're going to be bursting into your home at any time of night, 2 a.m., 5 a.m., which is usually the best time for them to implement those because they want to take you by surprise. So they go into your home, retrieve any firearms that they see or they know about or have been called in that situation. They go to the judge, and then the judge does an ex parte hearing, which means that you don't have to be, and most likely you won't be at that hearing when the judge decides and makes a decision that you can't have a firearm in your home for at least a year. So once that's already done, you have a year to try and get that firearm back. So all of those situations have already happened without your knowledge, without your say-so, and you have to pay money, legal fees, to go and get your firearm back. that person who, if you get your firearm back within a year, you have a year in order to get that back. But that person who called in for the first time doesn't get any repercussions and is able to continue to do that over and over again based on the law. So that is the law that so many people, some even Republicans I've seen, think that is a good law. Again, because you think of it and you think, oh yeah, I don't want it in the hands of someone bad. But you're thinking about someone on the other side who might have a vendetta against you, who might not like the fact that you voted for a certain way, or might not like the fact that, you know, that you have firearms in your home and they want to make the decision for you that you shouldn't have a firearm. And so that is how red flag laws are implemented, because they go against your Fourth Amendment right, they search and seizure, they go against so many different rights, unconstitutional in so many different ways. I mean, and then the fact that it's Second Amendment for one, but yeah, that's unfortunately what red flags actually are. And they usually are going to hurt the person who maybe goes to the therapist. Like, for example, I told you guys that I'm a sexual assault survivor. So someone knows that. Anybody at this point can say, well, I know Antonia Okafor is a sexual assault survivor. She's suffering through PTSD. She said that she takes medication for depression, anxiety. I know she's also a firearms advocate. More likely she has firearms in her home. I'm going to call up the sheriff's office and tell them that I don't think that she should have a firearm in her home. Ex parte, they do the hearing. I don't even know about it until the police department is knocking down my door, no knock, or not knocking down my door rather, but pushing down my door, saying that I need to get all my firearms out and give it to them. And I have a year to try and get that back on my own dime. So that's the actual implementation of red flag laws. And that's happening right now. You can go and look at it yourself, and that's happening in Colorado. So, which people think is a model legislation for red flag laws. So that's the reality of red flag laws and why they're so detrimental, but particularly to those like me, sexual assault survivors who, yes, have had these repercussions because they had something awful happen to them, like PTSD, like depression, like anxiety, but the very people, the very population who needs to protect themselves, who are vulnerable and defenseless, who have been before and they don't want to be vulnerable and defenseless anymore, those are the same people who would be hurt by red flag laws the most. So that's the problem with red flag laws.
Wow, thank you for explaining that. It's interesting and startling to see how people feel that is essentially the same thing that most gun control laws do. Is yes, there are bad things that happen, but often these are illegal acquisitions of firearms, and the laws are not going to stop that situation, which is really, that's the issue. There is an issue, but it's not people. Wow, that is astonishing. That's totally,
and that's why gun rights are really about empowering those who are trying to use firearms to defend themselves against the very real reality that law is not going to control morality, that people who are wanting to do harm to you will do harm to you regardless if it's the law or not, right? So it's about empowering people like us who are able to defend our lives against people who don't care about the law.
Yeah, 100%. Another question comes through is, recently President Biden said no amendment to the Constitution is absolute, in reference to the Second Amendment. What should conservatives be saying in response to that concept and perspective?
Someone, I think, I don't know if anybody knows Maj Touré, but he's always funny to me. He said, no president is absolute either. That's exactly why we have checks and balances, and that's exactly why we elect our officials. But you know what, even saying that, there are actually most of what goes on Second Amendment wise, the regulations, all have to do with the ATF. I don't know if people know about the ATF, the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau. So they're the ones who do most of the day-to-day, the reason why you have to go through a background check, the reason why you have to have this type of firearm, depending on the state, the reason why you have to have a Class 3 license, which is a certain very hard to get license in order to get a fully automatic firearm that not too long ago everybody was able to get. Things like that are through the ATF, which is a regulatory body that is isn't elected. Nobody there is elected, they're appointed. And so, for example, right now during the Biden administration, we have an administration that's very, very blatant about being anti-gun. Biden just put a new ATF president who has been very blatant about pushing gun control. His whole life, he's been a gun control activist for a long time. So obviously, it's not about people who are trying to uphold our Second Amendment. The government is only supposed to be there to help preserve our rights, to protect our rights. And I think that's what conservatives need to do a better job on, is the, again, like, shall not be infringed is part of the Second Amendment. But we need to remember that we tell people that it's not a constitutional right. That's something I hear a lot from even conservatives, is that they will misname the right that we have. It's not a constitutional right. It is a constitutional protection, but the right pre-exists the Second Amendment. It says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, meaning that we have a right as human beings from our Creator, a natural right that we are given that only should be protected through the Constitution, and the government is only supposed to be there to protect those rights. And so that is something that we need to continue to educate people on. The more I understood that, the better I realized that I could be a better advocate for people, and realize a lot of these things that people tend to think, oh, that's a good idea. But the fact of the matter is that my parents came to this country. They immigrated from Nigeria to America because we have a special government that is blatantly there to protect our rights as individuals, as human beings, very different than other countries in this world. And people do look to us for that freedom. And so we have this battle that happens all the time between freedoms and laws and rights, but we always put freedoms and rights first because those are innate as human beings. That is part of our imago Dei. That is part of our dignity as human beings that we were given by our Creator. And so that's why it's so important that we continue to educate people on that importance and that priority, and everything else comes second.
Excellent. Someone would like to know, do you go hunting?
I do go hunting now and then.
They'd like to know what your favorite thing to hunt is, if you do go.
Oh man, so I haven't hunted the whole gamut. I actually went turkey hunting for the first time a couple weeks ago. And after the third try, I finally got a turkey, a long beard. That was in Mississippi, so really thankful for that. So I went to Mississippi to do turkey hunting, and a couple years ago, I went pheasant hunting in Iowa. So I'm still looking to go deer hunting next. Is probably my next big thing, but I do go hunt a little bit. I didn't grow up hunting, so it's been a great experience to try that in my adult life.
Kind of fun. I've actually never been hunting myself. Both of my mom's family, my dad's family are all hunters. I could never bring myself to go hunting, but I love target practicing. It's a very fun hobby, I really think. But I think now I've been noticing the importance of it. It's not seen as a hobby, as actually seeing this as, like you were just saying, like a right, and this is essential. It's not even just that right, like you said. This was given to me by God. This is something that is inherent to my existence, to be able to protect myself.
Absolutely.
And I definitely felt more of a responsibility as a woman to be competent and capable so that I could defend myself if unfortunately that should ever happen.
Right. Well, even with hunting though, I think during COVID that a lot of people not only realized their gun rights, for self-protection, because a lot of police officers said, look, we're at capacity. We cannot help you. You're going to have to do it yourself. And the waiting times are longer than usual. But also with hunting, it's not only a right, but it's a life skill that there were times where like, we might have to grow our own food. We might have to, who knows, like first time, I think it was Vermont or one of those states that wasn't even allowing people to grow their own gardens, like like seeds and stuff like that. Plant seeds were off the market. They weren't seen as essential. So things like that, where you're like, you know what, I might have to make and grow my own food. I might have to hunt. Who knows what the world's gonna be like. So things like that, I think people woke up to, like, it's not just a hobby. It's not, just some recreational practice. It's something that's, again, inherent. The fact that I should be able to make my own food, get my own food, and defend myself. Two important things for living, for life.
Very key. We have one more question, but before we get to that, I'd like to ask, can you just talk a little more about when you mentioned constitutional carry? Can you just explain that for people who may not understand?
Yeah, so I think most people understand the permit system for actually every state. It's actually shall or may issue when it comes to concealed carry permits, at least. We'll go with that one. So meaning shall means that you don't have to ask any type of permission. As long as you pass a background check and you pay the fee for your permits, you're going to get your concealed carry permit. For example, Texas does that. And then there's may issue, where for unfortunately places like California, where you have to go to a sheriff's department, a county, and ask them, which is very sad, for that right to have a permit to be legally owning a firearm on your body outside of your home. So that's what concealed carry permits are for the most part. So that is essentially a permit system that really it's unconstitutional because, like I said, it's a pre-existing right to be able to keep and bear arms, meaning in your home or outside of your home. You don't need to have government permission to in order to do those things. And again, if you go back to the people think that you have to have a permit as a way to check people who shouldn't have guns. Well, if somebody is going to do anything illegal, which is obviously murder is always going to be an illegal thing. To hurt somebody else is going to be an illegal thing. Then that person will show it themselves to be someone who cannot have a firearm. But really, constitutionally, and also impact and implication on an application, it shows that constitutional carry, which there are many states already that have constitutional carry, where you don't have to ask the government permission and also pay them. That's another thing, in order to get a permit to say that you can have a firearm on your body, in your purse, anywhere outside of your home. In Texas, for example, it's called Castle Doctrine, where you don't need a permit to have a gun in your home or in your vehicle. But once you're outside of your home or your vehicle, then you have to ask government permission to get a permit, and also pay them up until a couple of years ago, the $140 to get a permit to say, yes, I can have a firearm on my person. So constitutional carrying is eliminating all of that. You still have to go through a background check in order to get your firearm, to purchase your firearm. That's separate from the permit system, but it's eliminating those financial barriers. It's eliminating the government barriers that keep people from being able to protect themselves outside of their home or vehicle.
Yeah, it sounds quite like that. Going back to shall not be infringed, that seems quite like an infringement, really.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And it becomes so normalized that people think that's the norm. I was talking on concealed carry. So for example, this is why I think this is also great to know for people who go against the grain. Like right now, it's the popular thing to be against rifles, for example. But if you look back in the 80s, even the 90s, early 90s, handguns were the boogeyman. You know, that was the big and bad type of firearm at the time. People were upset about handguns. And actually, there are many big initiatives that tried to ban handguns altogether. Otis McDonald, who was an African-American in Chicago, actually went against that in the McDonald v. Chicago case in Washington, D.C., and he won that. And that was essentially to say that every person should have the ability to have a firearm on their body. A handgun is concealable. It's something you can take with you outside of your home without anybody knowing, and that anybody, especially in places like Chicago, and in a dangerous area, you should be able to defend yourself. And so that was a big controversial thing, handguns. And now, looking at 2020, it's rifles. Like rifles are the big thing. Even though if you look at 2019 statistics of FBI statistics, you'll see that more people were killed by hands, clubs, and feet. Yes, hands, clubs, and feet. Than rifles were actually murdered by those tools, just like anything is a tool, than rifles. So that's what we're seeing, is like these people who were okay with handguns now, but weren't okay with that a few decades ago. Same thing with concealed carry. concealed carry used to be actually something that was seen as bad for the gun control side. They wanted open carry. That's what you'll notice in a lot of states that tend to be very gun control heavy these days. They actually have open carry without a permit. So for example, looking at Colorado again, Colorado actually has open carry without a permit. You have to have a permit to conceal carry, but you don't need a permit in order to open carry. Same thing with Nevada. So the reason and the thinking behind that was that gun control activists actually believed that it was beneficial for somebody who had a firearm to show that they had a firearm. So they wanted more people who had guns to show that they had firearms, so they knew who had guns. And so that's why traditionally and historically, the laws for gun control advocates in gun control states have been that open carry is a permitless type of carry, but concealed carry, where you can't see the person who has a firearm and the firearm that they have, that was only through permits. And so now you can see that that shifted the other way around, where now people don't want to see firearms at all. But that just goes to show the fads that come around with gun control, and really there's no logical rhyme or reason to really why they don't want you to have a firearm, other than the end goal of not allowing anybody to have guns at all in general.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been so educational. And our last question that we like to ask everybody who comes on the webinar is, what are some books you recommend for young women to read, or is something maybe recently you've read that you think would do something helpful for our young women to read?
Oh man, I want to go down to my library and go show all the books that I have. For the sake of time, I won't. But so, and when it comes to women, so gun rights and women's rights, it's a really extensive, great book called Gun Women. Really Gun Women, and that is about the history of women and being pro-gun. And it's actually, I believe, one of them, if not both the authors, are actually liberal women. So just goes to show like the sexism that happens with the narrative, and like I was talking about, and why being pro-women is being pro-Second Amendment. So Gun Women is a book that I think gives a really good comprehensive history about gun rights, about DC Heller, that court case that essentially said that you have an individual right to keep and bear arms. And all the cases I talked about is Gun Fight. It's a book called Gun Fight, and it gives a very good, pretty quick read about the overall history, about like the pivotal fights, the pivotal Supreme Court cases, et cetera, that we've had in American history that pertains to firearms. And they talk about minority history and why Black history actually benefited most from having gun rights versus gun control. So those are two very good books on both those issues that I think is a great way to start.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And before we let you go, I just have to say that your little boy is just so precious. And I love when I'm on Instagram and I see the little videos and the photos. I think that's the most beautiful baby I think I've ever seen. So I just want you to know you're raising a beautiful little baby, and we adore him here in the office. So
oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
Congratulations.
I adore him too.
Yeah, congratulations on becoming a mom. We are all really excited for you here.
Thank you.
But now's our time to wrap up. But thank you so much for educating us. Thank you so much for speaking to us today and answering all these questions. I know that you've inspired some young women to maybe take some steps out of their comfort zone if they've never taken an opportunity to go shooting before. So I really appreciate that. This is what we really want to do, is educate. So I appreciate your help in that. Thank you everyone for attending, and everyone, I hope you have a lovely afternoon.